place of women in successor organizations. One could say I could have taken the Ridley Road to this. However, my research has remained mainly in the interwar era. What I've done is changed gear thematically, broadly speaking, women in anti-fascist politics, women in the Conservative Party, all things Munich crisis and appeasement, and currently a social history of mental health in Britain in the lead up to the Second World War. Nonetheless, the chronological bookends of my work on fascist women are in no ways rigid. The kind of detective work, the kind of human interactions we inevitably experience as part of any research in contemporary history means that I've not only been studying the atrophied past, but in fact, the memory politics of British fascism. Can I just stop here? Is the sound quality okay? Is it too loud or too quiet, or is it echoing? Or no, okay, no echo. Okay. All right, so to put it another way, the story of fascist women in interwar Britain was first considered as the past history and the continuous stream of happenings that constitute the past. However, the process of studying fascist women involves the existing history or historical awareness, which refers to the present interpretation or reinterpretation of the past. So more recently, there's been a much more of a stake and much more at issue than skirmishes over the memory politics of the radical right. Of late, the past has become all too present. Let's go back to a few years to 2016, a portentous year in so many respects. Thomas Mair, a follower of the British far right, was convicted of the murder of Labour MP Joe Cox. In his murderous rage, Mair shouted, "Britain first, this is for Britain," an all too familiar and haunting slogan that had been used by Sir Oswald Mosley's British Union of Fascists in the 1930s. They couldn't find anyone else, so I was invited onto Sky News to offer some historical perspective. I guess Matt was too busy that day. Now, sharing on Facebook what was for me a rare television appearance, an old friend from my PhD days commented that she was happy for me to get this kind of exposure, but also very depressed that my specialist subject was again newsworthy. And that really kind of struck a chord with me. Indeed, when I started my research on women and fascism in the mid-1990s, even with the regrouping of the far right and the British National Party and its worrying electoral successes, fascism and anti-Semitism nonetheless occupied a political space firmly at the margins. Fascism had been largely discredited and delegitimized and consigned to a dark age before 1945. And I think that dovetails nicely with some comments David Rich made earlier in the roundtable discussion. So there are striking continuities in the ways that women are victims of fascist machismo, sexism, and misogyny. The Joe Cox tragedy illustrates this, as do the repeated anti-Semitic attacks on Jewish women MPs. A member of the neo-Nazi National Action was convicted of racially aggravated harassment of Luciana Berger, MP, in December 2016. Minority women are the victims of what I would term a double helix of hate, victimized because of their sex and their ethno-religious identity. Similarly, feminists are figures of hate. Starting in the 1920s, in the fascist imagination, feminists and feminism were conflated with Judeo-cosmopolitanism and decadence, ideas that were propelled by deep male insecurities about the governing state, as it was often termed, and the threat of a new matriarchy and newly enfranchised women's disproportionate electoral power after the losses and the disproportionately male losses of the First World War. Women were among the purveyors and the disseminators of this conspiracy narrative, including Mrs. Nesta Webster, who had more than one afterlife and a resurgence in her popularity thanks to the internet and social media and all the kind of material that we've been discussing mainly here today. The Cultural War was not unique, or is not unique to our moment in history. It is exciting to see this new sophisticated research at just this nexus and the 2021 Anti-Semitism and Misogyny report commissioned by Hope Not Hate and the Anti-Semitism Policy Trust investigates, as I quote their own description, investigates the ways in which anti-feminism and misogyny can act as slip roads towards anti-Semitism and other forms of racism due to perceived loss of status among white men and women based on gender and racial hierarchies. From another perspective, women are neither immune to ultra nationalist and racist ideology, nor does the far right reject their participation. Instead, actively exploiting the publicity value, the veneer of respectability, and the political normalization that women's support provides and insinuates. There has been a persistence in the way that women have belied essentialized expectations about sex and gender to emerge as activist leaders and perpetrators of the far right, of populist, of xenophobic, and anti-Semitic parties and groups. This deepening relationship and apparent compatibility between women and the far right can be illustrated in many national examples, some of which have been spoken about today. The United States, France, Poland, Germany immediately come to mind, with similarities in the ways that women rise to leadership roles and public-facing prominence while pursuing an anti-progressive agenda. The first presentation today showed an excellent example from Spain, making this point even more vivid. So there's a spectrum here. In the British context, it's notable that the populist Brexit UKIP elected Diane James, as leader, albeit only for, I think, 3 weeks in 2016. Jada Franson acted as deputy leader of the far-right group Britain First. And in 2019, the press picked up on stories of Barbies and far-right female influencers, as they were described, who had been luring other women via social media into the highly male milieu of neo-fascism, alt-right, and anti-Islam politics. The roles and prominence of women on the far right and the dynamic between gender and fascism, populism, and extremism has evolved and expanded, requiring less of a suspension of disbelief about women's extremism and their potential for radicalism. Indeed, the focused study of and expanding scholarship on women and the right has done much to historicize more recent trends in women's politicization at the ideological extremes. So against this backdrop, what new meaning, what new understanding can be taken from the case of the 1930s? Now, the publication in 2021 as a second edition of my monograph, Feminist Fascism, 20 years after its first publication, provided me with a welcome moment for reflection and a chance to consider the afterlife of the book and the afterlives of those who figure in the book. A great deal has happened, as we know, in the 20 years since the research for feminine fascism. For reasons that are cause for deep concern and that none of us are, of course, pleased about, renewed interest in the topic has been spurred by the unabated resurgence of populism, white supremacy, conspiracy theory, and fascistic tendencies in politics on a global scale. For these reasons, no doubt, my publisher, IB Tauris, acquired by Bloomsbury, offered me the opportunity of this second edition with a new preface. You could say it's the 20th anniversary edition, and it was published, as I say, exactly 1 year ago. Now, since it's the first anniversary of this 20th anniversary edition, my feeling is, well, any excuse for a party, as long as said celebrations don't contravene COVID-19 restrictions, of course. Okay. But on a more serious note, speaking to a room of experts and interested parties, there should be little need to state the obvious, namely that the studying of the history of fascism in our era of resurgent ultranationalism is urgent and not just a matter of curiosity. There is also a poignant moment. This is also a poignant moment to view and review the individual life stories of fascist women, as the angle of the lens has very noticeably shifted in recent years. Former fascist Great-grandmothers, grandmothers, mothers, and aunties are viewed by their descendants rather differently than the case would have been 20 or 25 years ago. There's a generation gap here that I want to kind of unpick and think about. It's always a concern, and increasingly so, for historians and educators in the field of Holocaust studies and fascism, how the distance of time and the diminishing numbers of witnesses and survivors means that the visceral memory of fascist violence and terror tends to, of course, recede and fade. So the increasing remoteness of the period of the 1930s invites reassessment and emotionally tone-deaf revision, not to mention at the more extreme, disastrous distortion and conspiracy. So what I'm trying to do today in this presentation is to track and trace and make sense of the changing reputations and representations of some of the key women figures in Britain's fascist movement, particularly as they've been rediscovered and reinvented on the internet, in novels and fictionalized accounts, and in family memories and memoirs as well. In each case, these new representations, these rescued often reputations, tell us a lot more about the time they've been forged than about the lives of the women themselves who were active in the movement in the period from the 20s to the 40s. These types of explorations should be a way to engage with one key theme of this event, namely the memory politics of the radical right. And that's where I start to feel a little bit less like an imposter, but you might still think I am one. So I apologize in advance that much of this will be anecdotal and speculative, although I very much hope that we can compare notes and share research experiences, that we can generate as a result some more conceptual and theoretical propositions based on these, what are ultimately my sharing with you is the experiences I'm sharing with you. I want to think about the implications of what Jay Winter so memorably termed the memory boom. Since the 1960s, the memory boom has been facilitated by the expansion of higher education, rising rates of literacy and cultural literacy, a period of relative, at least a kind of cold peace, and of course, affluence. As Winter says, dwelling on memory is a matter of both disposable income and leisure time. But what are the implications of the memory boom in the context of fascist lives and fascist families? How is the wide expansion of popular and family history fed a nostalgia, a disconcerting one about fascist aunties and grannies? What are the ethical and psychological costs of reconnecting with fascist pasts or giving voice to the voiceless? Or in this case, maybe you could even say the silenced. In the British context, fascism was a political failure, and therefore there were no public monuments, at least none that celebrate the Mosleyites. Likewise, there are no commemorative events in the national calendar that speak for the contribution of British fascists to the greater good. British fascists are, of course, anathema to the collective, and it follows that their experiences are not part of the mosaic of collective memory. The memory work we're talking about here tends to occur in private, if not in secret, because of the shame and the stigma attached to revelations of fascist pasts and fascists in the family. Yet this stigma and the experience of more than 1,000 members who were interned and detained without trial from May 1940 under the defense regulations means that for many of these people, and for many of some of their descendants too, they regard themselves as victims and victims of the state. As such, many former internees proposed a false equivalency between the persecution of minorities and genocide in Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia with the British concentration camp system, as they put it, because they had been held in internment camps under the defense regulations. Former black shirt Robert Rowe's formulation is illustrative here. He referred to the ludicrous proposition of a Britain at war with the Nazi concentration camp regime while maintaining a concentration camp regime of its own. Diana Mosley made similar statements and false equivalencies. Many experienced trauma, that's true. They witnessed traumatic events, only reinforcing their sense of victimhood. That fascists acted as victimizers and traumatized their political opponents and their political victims, British Jews in particular, makes it much more difficult to know what to do with their own experiences of trauma and their own traumatic memory. So to put it another way, who do these fascists think they are? Obviously, I'm working here to reference and to repurpose the highly successful format of BBC's Who Do You Think You Are? I have yet to think of a way to weave in a pitch for a new site called fascistancestry.com. But of course, all of these are the most tangible products of the memory boom, and we have to think about how we could, again, rebrand and repurpose that, or how fascists might rebrand and repurpose those for their own purposes. I've already spoken a bit about the aftermath and afterlives of feminine fascism, but I should have probably told the story from the beginning. Let me elaborate a little bit here on my own journey and the time I've spent in the figurative company of British fascist women. And it's been about 28 years now, which is scary to think. So it pains me to say it, but it's been more than a quarter of a century, more than half my life that I've shared kind of headspace with these British fascist women. Contrary to my initial expectations, when I started the research, I quickly discovered that women were deeply involved and influential in Britain's fascist movement. The first British fascist movement was founded in 1923, as our chronology tells us in the corner, by Miss Rothall Lintorn Orman, and her British fascist organization was increasingly managed and manned, excuse the pun, by women. When I first encountered her, her contemporaries, and then the first generation of historians who studied her, had characterized and caricatured her as an extremist and as an eccentric. She was a pioneer Girl Scout. She was an ex-servicewoman. She was a super patriot who in 1923 had an epiphany while working in her Somerset kitchen garden to weed out the reds, the pinks, and the alien invaders from the body politics, just as she had done from her garden. So as a woman in a man's world, and in a hyper-masculine movement at that, her sex seemed to immediately cancel her chances of political success. So it was easy for both fascists and anti-fascists to dismiss her and the movement she founded as a glorified boys' brigade run by women, which was said of it at the time. Meanwhile, her appearance as a mannish woman only reinforced the misfit of fascism in Britain. In fact, Lintorn Orman had been one of the figures who has come in for some of the most radical rereading. And I would speculate that there is more of that to come for these very reasons. Why? Well, it has almost nothing to do with her politics, which is the worrying thing, and almost everything to do with her gender identity. Her defining features, her crafting of her gender identity has excited the interest of those searching for a longer history of the LGBTQ+ movement. Looking back at the life stories of former suffragette turned policewoman Commandant Mary Allen, or the National Fascistes Colonel Barker, also known as Valerie Arkell Smith, each look like sexual mavericks and trailblazers in some important respects. Espied through the unquestioned heteronormative lens, they were easily dismissed and mocked because they were out, or at least as out as one could be in the context of their own time. This is at least partially problematic, though. And the noxious content of their politics is too often ignored or dismissed in inverse proportion to their avant-garde sexual identities. Moving forward into the 1930s, Sir Oswald Mosley's British Union of Fascists was also much more successful at mobilizing women than I would have expected. Women accounted for 25% of the movement's membership. Mosley praised women's fanaticism, his words, not mine, for building the movement. Women represented at least 30% who were prominent at marches and rallies. And of the those who were interned, 100 fascist women were deemed dangerous enough to national security to be interned under the defense regulations during the Second World War. From being largely ignored by the androcentric myopia of fascist historiography, British fascist women were made visible in the 1990s in the work of Martin Durham and my work as well. But making these women visible was not the same recuperative process as carried out by other historians of women. And women's historians who were, of course, nurtured in the second wave feminist movement, where researching women's lives functioned as a political tool. Both Durham and I were careful to nuance the nature of fascist women's political activism and exercise caution, even great caution, before equating women's political activism with fascist activism. My book is deliberately titled Feminine, not Feminist, Fascism, for that very reason, to announce and to emphasize that not all women's political engagement is feminist, and not all women's political participation, no matter how committed, no matter how strident, no matter how formidable, is motivated by a liberationist impulse. We must insist, I think, and I still feel strongly about that, that feminism as a term, as an ideology, and as a set of practices never can be divorced from the fundamental beliefs in liberty, equality, and sorority. However, the temptation to claim fascist women for feminism, or more oppositely, the desire of women on the far right to claim some variant of feminism as their own, means that this is far from a settled case. Let me give you one, I think, vivid example of this. In March 2021, Front National leader Marine Le Pen claimed the feminist label for herself, even if she was careful to qualify it. She said, "Je suis un féministe qui m'exprime pas d'hostilité à le regard des hommes." I'm a feminist who does not express hostility to men. Now, this kind of formulation is not a million miles away from what Mosleyite women were saying, and the way that they were appropriating the language and the labels of feminism in the 1930s. And they did so with some justification in the context, as 3 of the women leaders of the movement had been suffragettes 20 years before. We can therefore see what can happen when we take these women at their own word. Now, there's a more intimate dimension as well, and another way in which the story of women in British fascism that I started to tell in my book is still unfolding 20 plus years later. And this is the aspect I want to spend more time exploring now. So we already know about some of the main figures in the book, thanks to the painstaking research of other interested parties, such as Geoffrey Walder's discovery of what happened to Olive Hawks here after the war. Geoffrey Walder was one of the founders and consistent driving forces behind the organization the Friends of Oswald Mosley, founded in the early 1980s as a fraternity, although women were included as well, of former members and Mosley supporters. One of the Friends of OM's main motivation was to set the record straight as they saw it by publishing a regular newsletter called Comrade, recording oral histories, testimonies, republishing Mosley's works, and as the World Wide Web started to spin, taking advantage of the internet as a platform to interest a new generation in their much sanitized accounts of what it was like living the life of a black shirt. Indeed, their activities, publications, and websites offer a ready-made case study illustrating how fascists capitalized on the memory boom. Walder became especially intrigued by Olive Hawks here, a young woman who had emerged as the leader of the British Union's women's section after the war broke out. She was interned, the longest of all the women detained under Defense Regulation 18B. But after the war, she transformed herself into a novelist and a collaborator with the Jewish doctor, Eustace Chesser, on a self-help book, before completely disappearing without a trace. Walder was intrigued by her, as was I, and he did painstaking work to find out that she did marry again, a third time indeed, or a second time. She had children. She emigrated to Australia, where in the early 1990s she died alone, apparently. Clearly, there are still stories to tell and trails to follow in making sense of lives shaped by adherence to interwar British fascism. Now, Olive Hawkes's reputation and importance has also been recalibrated due to the notice of scholars. Literary critic Judy Gottlieb has studied Hawkes's literary oeuvre with a focus on her novel, What Hope for Green Street, published in 1945, written while Hawkes was interned under Defense Regulation 18B. The novel offers a fictional account of black shirt life in the East End of London, pretty standard fare, or certainly the kind of fare we'd expect from her. The novel is utterly transparent in its high regard for the fascist movement, its promotion of anti-Semitic stereotypes, and a blatant nostalgia for the days when British fascists could take pride in their movement, take to their streets, and so forth. Ultimately, it's a work not only of fiction, but of self-defense and an apologia by a woman who was amongst, as I say, only a small handful interned for the longest period, even longer than Mosley himself. Hawkes's long spell in Holloway prison can only be explained by her militancy, her refusal to repent, and her tangled love story with two members of the movement, the young black shirt and wartime conscientious objector Burdett, whom she married when they were both very young, and the older and well-established BUF figurehead Alexander Raven Thompson, the movement's chief ideologue and putative philosopher. So far, so predictable. But then Hawkes remade herself, and we must presume whitewashed her black shirt past. She began this transformation with the next stage of her literary career and the publication of 3 more novels that had nothing whatsoever to do with politics of any hue. These were novels whose titles probably give away their kind of, their very kind of interior quotidian themes. Time is my debtor, 1947. These frail vessels, 1948. A sparrow for a farthing, 1950. In 1951, as I said, she collaborated with psychiatrist and sexologist Eustace Chesser, on a kind of self-help book called Life Lies Ahead, a practical guide to homemaking and the development of personality, 1951. Her literary output made Hawkes a ripe subject for literary history and literary criticism, or at least of the middle brow variety. So Judy Shu's PhD, The Seductive Fallacy, studies 2 fascist and 3 anti-fascist novels. Wyndham Lewis's The Revenge of Love, Olive Hawkes's What Hope for Green Street, Virginia Woolf's The Years, Phyllis Bottom's The Mortal Storm, and all as a means of theorizing modern women's social, political, and cultural agency. It's noteworthy the way that Hawkes's novel is read alongside these prominent modernist writers who form part of the canon. One can only wonder what Hawkes herself would have made of this significant achievement. Does Hawkes deserve this kind of notice? Does she deserve to be placed amongst such austere company? While I never managed to track down Hawkes herself or any of her descendants, I did connect with a number of subjects of my research, participants and witnesses. So when researching the book, a few former BUF members already in old age were very much forthcoming, actually, and agreed to be interviewed, mainly by correspondence. In the days before people were accustomed to email, this involved written correspondence on real paper, imagine, with envelopes and stamps and everything. Now, I had these exchanges with Diana Mosley, with Birmingham Women's District leader Louise Irvine, and the friends of Oswald Mosley's leading lights, John Warburton and Jeffrey Walder and Robert Rowe. Walder was the only one of these who was relatively youthful, as he himself had been a member of Mosley's union movement rather than the BUF. In any case, each was forthcoming, and even as a novice researcher, I was aware that they were ready to answer my questions. Not all my questions, but to do so in order to tell their stories, and in order to control their reputations and their legacies. The method of conducting oral history, or in this case, oral history by correspondence, was available to me in the 1990s, but less clear was how to work with potentially hostile witnesses. I can admit that I worried that I was naive and to be interviewing people and providing them with the soapbox. There were a couple of historians in the field, such as Dave Renton, who felt strongly about fascist sources, that they were tainted, and that historians who generated them or even used them were doing the bidding of the fascists. I think that still remains a controversial, if not an extreme view. I am still convinced that historians of fascism cannot get away with swerving around sources generated by fascists themselves. We deserve some credit, I think, to be able to differentiate a subjective narration, delusion, and blatant agenda from detached chronicling of the polarized politics of the 1930s. Indeed, it's revealing and indeed fascinating to see how these personal narratives are spun, how they're contrived and contorted, the intellectual and psychological acrobatics that these people have learned to perform for decades, especially in the cases I'm referring to here, where none of them felt any remorse or wished to repent for such errors of political judgment. My own strategy as a young woman then, as a foreigner, as someone with a foreign sounding name, was to be on my best behavior in order to elicit frank and full responses. I can't deny that this caused me some personal discomfort, inner conflicts, and moral quandaries as well. I had to ask, was I dishonoring and betraying my own past, my own family, my own family memory in giving these Mosleyites, the benefit of my good manners and my suspension of disbelief, at least. Less morally challenging were my encounters with the offspring of British fascists. And I met with both Nicholas Mosley and Trevor Grundy and engaged in a more heated correspondence back then with Francis Beckett. All three had or were soon to write their own family histories, each one a writer by profession and by vocation. In all cases, these were sons who had difficult relationships and ambivalent feelings about their fathers. On the one hand, that put me at my ease and made these exchanges very different from the aforementioned ones with unrepentant black shirts. On the other hand, however, as ambivalent as these men were about their parents, and no matter what they suffered personally and publicly because of the stigma coming from fascist families, we were still talking about their families. Blood is thicker than water, after all. Next, I would like to explore how feminine fascism has had an afterlife, and I think made an impact on people's lives. Impact agenda, ring, ring, ring here. Now, as time wore on, it was descendants of former members for whom the stories were ongoing and often disconcertingly and distressingly unfinished. Later generations sought to come to terms or sometimes deal with shocking revelations about fascists in the family. The prosopography of feminine fascism, that the who's who at the back of the book, has proven to be a useful resource for scholars as well as for those conducting genealogical research 80 to 90 years after the fact, and in many cases after years of silence and secrecy. So Trevor Grundy's revealing and moving memoir of a fascist childhood came out around the same time as feminine fascism, and others followed suit in delving into family histories bound up with the black shirts. So over the years, I've been approached on numerous occasions by relatives of BUF figures, including the women interviewed in the BBC Radio 4 program, Mother Was a Black Shirt, former suffragette turned fascist Nora Ellam's granddaughter and great-granddaughter, Susan and Angela McPherson, and the offspring of Doreen Bell and Alma Hudson, for instance. But again, something of a personal self-reflexive note here. As much as I have taken professional satisfaction from helping others solve their ancestral mysteries, I've also been conflicted, as I say, in the role. It is one thing to play a part in preserving the history of women and men who either achieved great things or perhaps those who lived more mundane lives, but who nonetheless deserve to be rescued from obscurity, the people we would normally encounter or who have become accessible to us thanks to the memory boom. It's another thing, however, when you are in complete and passionate disagreement with the core beliefs and actions of the subjects of your research, and when your own immediate ancestors found themselves on the diametrically opposite side of history. Both my parents were born in Hungary during the Second World War, before the Second World War, but endured it, forever marked by a childhood of persecution, trauma, and loss at the hands of the Nazis, the very people British fascists regarded as worthy allies and tried to emulate. So I'm sure I'm not alone among conference participants, amongst researchers in this field who grapple with these personal, ethical, and emotional dilemmas. So I'm not going to bore you with a long list of those who have approached me to fill out their family trees, but I will share a couple of more recent experiences now, because I think they are instructive or they kind of bring up some points nicely. First, in 2018, I was emailed by the daughter of a former active member of the BUF. As a young woman, her mother had been an active member, and fascist politics was very much a family affair, with her parents and other relatives all prominent in the movement. The lady was now in her 90s, and she was ready and eager to share her story. And that it became part of the archive and the special collections of the University of Sheffield was her aspiration. As her daughter put it, "My mom is delighted someone out there might be keen to listen to her grubby, shameful stories." This is what she wrote, which is how she describes them to me, how she described them to me this morning. It's hard to know how much she allows herself to remember and how much of her forgetting is influenced by her deep shame. But she revealed today she has things to tell a stranger, which she will refuse to talk about with her family. The impulse here was to set the story straight, but with a clear sense of regret and the desire to confess and thereby repent. This is not always how fascist afterlives are lived and narrated, however. Let me share with you another experience, which again provides an interesting contrast. And this occurred a couple of months ago. I was contacted by a researcher from another part of the world. I'll try to anonymize as much as possible. And he had recently discovered that his grandmother had been an active member of the Worthing branch of the British Union of Fascists. While he wanted to research her story, he was also trying to fictionalize this account for his own interests and for his own project. As he wrote, "My grandmother's name was such and such." I know it, but I will excise it. "The piece is about her in the first ever visit to the old town hall in Worthing of Moseley and the BUF on the 1st of December, 1933. My grandmother would have been 20 years old at the time. I'm interested as to why she would have gone to this meeting. Mind you, I can't actually be certain that she did, and her reasoning behind her support of fascism. As I'm sure you've heard plenty of times, this is not something I saw in my grandmother, and unfortunately only found out about long after she passed away." Right, so we already have a real kind of distancing, a real, again, a much milder response to this fascist past. This, I think, is quite obviously a good example of the nostalgic effect, and one that doesn't seem to dissipate much, even upon the discovery that a much-loved grandmother was a committed fascist. I'm not suggesting that the writer was overtly sympathetic to his grandmother's politics, but I still sensed that the shame was already less oppressive than had this been from the previous generation. Further, I was curious why he decided to use her story as the material for fiction. Perhaps this made it less painful, a less painful way of coming to terms with this dark history. However, fictional accounts also tend to idealize. They tend to rationalize, they empathize, they simplify, they even romanticize. Historical fiction is still fiction, And its success is measured by literary qualities, by dramatic effect, by character description, by plot devices, and page-turning pacing. Only in a very secondary way is historical fiction judged by its accuracy and authenticity. This then brings me to sharing with you some of my experience supporting and collaborating with writers developing fictionalized accounts of Black shirt women. And there have been many of these and even more attempts to do so. The four-part biopic, Mosley, was aired in 1998, drawing on his son's, Nicholas Mosley's, two-volume family memoir. And it demonstrates well how the movement and its leadership presents all the elements that make for a diverting and sensational storytelling. Rebellion and seething violence. Just look around the room here. It's illustrated beautifully for me. Sexual intrigue and glamour. The incongruity between Mosley's private life, of course he married a Mitford, and the impact of the deprivation of the Great Depression on many of his Black shirt recruits. And the distinctive form of political theater and that the BUF developed in its spectacular meetings with its uniforms, the creating of an aestheticized politics that borrowed from other European fascisms. Mosley was a political celebrity in post-First World War politics, first a promising leading man of parliamentary politics, and then by his own doing, a villain and hate figure. And he has remained and been reincarnated as a celebrity or of a celebrity of notoriety, we could say, in recent decades. Despite the BUF's failure to make inroads into electoral politics, in 2006, Sir Oswald Mosley topped the BBC History magazine's poll as Worst Briton of the 20th century. In the last 2 decades, Mosley has been fictionalized in Guy Walter's The Leader, on television in Peaky Blinders, as a cameo in The World on Fire in 2019, in all cases depicted with considerable poetic license. But it's not only Mosley as villain who has captured the imagination. And 2 novels were published very close together, in fact, with female protagonists. And the story and the setting are very similar too. Both novelists, Juliette West, the author of The Faithful, and Cressida Connolly, who wrote After the Party, took inspiration, or at least claimed to take inspiration, from feminine fascism. They also have in common that they treat very similar themes, and they use the BUF's Celsea summer camp as the main setting. But of course, I had no influence particularly, or any control certainly, on how much or how little they used from the historical sources. Certainly after the party was a popular success, and just by the by, I discovered that it was a selection for one of my friends' book clubs, so it must have been popular. Connolly is the daughter of writer and critic Cyril Connolly, and she herself a journalist and novelist. But she actually came to the material of the novel because of a family history, not her own, but her husband's. That might suggest to us that Connolly would be less protective, more ready to call a spade, and unambiguously condemn her characters for their political choices and actions. Not quite. And instead, it is an uncomfortable read, I think, in some places, especially because of the obvious sympathy and pathos she feels for her protagonists. All the more because the story is told in retrospect, with the traumatic experience of internment as the life-changing event. Nicola Baldwin's play, We the Young Strong, staged in October 2019 in London, not far from here in the Bloomsbury Theatre, is similarly centered around a female character, but this time a northern working class woman drawn to the BUF because of its appeal to the economically disenfranchised. Baldwin was drawn to the subject matter and created her characters because of the parallels she identified between the perpetual crises of the 1930s and the post-2008 socioeconomic crisis with its resurgent populism. Indeed, there's a clear trend here in that fictionalized or caricatured Mosley figures pop up in profusion, I think, at moments of contemporary crisis and when the radical right is emboldened nationally or on a global scale. Now, we could well discuss the pros and cons, the benefits or demerits to the historical record, to accurate recall and memory, to the truth of fictional reworking. In all the above cases, the authors did their research. They visited archives. Some of them talked to me. They interviewed participants, and each wanted to be truthful and authentic in portraying the backdrop for the made-up characters. Still, the distance of time, a process of relativization and defamiliarization, the fundamental literary device of empathy, is coupled with a feminist paradox to recast the mold of feminized fascism. The feminist paradox I'm referring to is this: when we foreground fascist women's womanhood, their gender, when we see them as women, it's inevitable that they will be cast as rebels and revolutionaries, as the weaker sex, demanding their place in the most man-made and hyper-masculine political movement in 20th century politics. All these tendencies together create either an attitude of ambivalence or at best, a not so grudging admiration at worst. Let us not forget too that writing women into the history of British fascism sits uneasily in the Women's History Project. Since the late 1960s, women's history has been a key political tool of the women's liberation movement, with early efforts and methodological innovations developed to record the lives and to rescue the memory of those who had been the forerunners of modern activism. I've already made the point that this is that it is vital to recognize that women's politicization and activism can occur outside the framework of fascism, of feminism. But how do we refine our concepts when confronted by the fact that former suffragettes, Mary Richardson, Mary Allen, and Nora Ellum, rose to prominent positions in the British Union of Fascists? That formula still doesn't account for the prominence of these three former suffragettes. It should come as little surprise that readers find their stories the most fascinating, and worryingly, I sense that some would like to use them as evidence for either the sexual progressiveness of fascism or the corruption of feminism. Neither of these conclusions, I think, though, bear up to much scrutiny. We have to emphasize that only 3 suffragettes joined the black shirts. They were aberrations, while the vast majority of their former sisters in arms rejected extremism. A wide range of women joined the BUF, including these 3 who had been initiated into militancy in the Pankhurst Women's Social and Political Union. And there, again, a much wider range of women joined the movement: middle class, Tories, working class women, and women from across the country and across the social spectrum. And what they shared was an attraction to the leader, etc. Indeed, during the past decades, historians have more thoroughly interrogated what happened to feminism between the wars, demonstrating how, despite the obvious decline in contrast to the climax of the pre-war suffrage movement, feminist principles became mainstreamed after the vote was won. The phenomenon of black shirt women has to be set in that wider context, as deeply flawed and ultimately failed expressions of women's politicization and the aftermath of suffrage. That being said, popular interest and popular misconceptions of British fascism are most evident in the stories told about these suffragette fascists. Again and again, when I've been interviewed by journalists for podcasts, etc., I can count on the fact that their interest was sparked by these 3 women. Sensational and misleading headlines like "Why Former Suffragettes Flocked to British Fascism" kind of illustrates that point well. Here too, the politics of memory is intricate, complicated, and contradictory, as pride and awe at the heroism of militant suffragettes collides and crashes with the suffrage afterlives as xenophobes, anti-Semites, ultranationalists, and would-be persecutors. Finally, there is the Mitford factor. Arguably, with the way the British deal with the memory of their indigenous fascist past has a lot to do with the unabated fascination with glamorous aristocrats behaving badly and the fetishization of all things patrician and affected. How could fascism be alien? How could it be awful? How could anyone say it posed a real threat if the political and social elite were its leaders, admirers, and fellow travelers? Look at how effortlessly, well, at least eventually, Diana Mosley re-entered society, becoming a prolific writer of belles lettres and memoir. She and her family were not shunned, and in most circles, not even shamed. This was even more true for the next generation of Mosleys, who either waxed lyrical about their dramatic family histories, especially the Guinnesses, the children from Diana's first marriage, and now the now late Max Mosley, who was never convincing in coming to terms with his family's fascist legacy. The Mitford sisters remained the gift that keeps on giving for newspapers and magazine editors, with semi-regular puff pieces in magazines like The Tatler or Tatler. Indeed, popular interest in the topic of British fascism, and more specifically women in fascism, is also often sparked by Mitford mania, what I would call. The Mitfords as a brand, as evidenced by this Gucci sweater from 2018 with the phrase "never marry a Mitford," suggest only the most threadbare understanding of the historical context. Okay, so in conclusion, what I've offered here is a series of vignettes that in different ways illustrates the volatile reputations as well as the complex emotional terrain of being related to women who were incontrovertibly on the wrong side of history, feeling as they did wronged by the liberal democratic project. I make no claim that what I've presented here is other than a series of linked anecdotes and some insights into my own kind of encounters with British fascists and their descendants. But I do hope that some of the issues raised and the problematics identified, I do hope they could be the basis for a theoretical reflection. I'm hoping that you have heard echoes of your own work and experience working on fascism here, and that we can kind of compare notes. We can find some common ground as we dodge the shrapnel left by the memory boom. So thanks very much for listening, and I would be delighted to join in any discussion. Just in case.
Yeah, I just get to go first. Yeah.
Questions, but I'll ask kind of two in one thing. The first one is, I guess, how does the gender affect the way these individuals are engaging with fascism? How does it affect their experience of fascism, I guess? Is it a man and a woman in the 1930s both joined the BUF, and what their understanding of fascism will be the same, they're just different genders? Or is there some sort of the genders they bring to their engagement with fascist texts, etc., is somehow changed? Is it like a Lady Macbeth, unsex me here thing, and they all go? So it's a bit of a broad question, but are they having different experiences of fascism? And the second one is more about the kind of continuing interest or obsession in, you mentioned lots up there, but I mean, at Hope Not Hate, I would say at least once a month get a journalist ring up saying, I'm writing a story about women in the fascist movement. And you kind of mentioned 25% of the BUF was women. You mentioned Le Pen, two far-right groups in the UK are run by women. It's not an aberration in any way whatsoever. And yet all these journalists saying, I want to write a story about this new trend of women in fascism. Is that just ignorance, or is it that there is still some sort of misogynist shock value in, as you say, like the weaker sex getting involved in this manly pursuit? And for some people, that will forever be an anathema. Why is there this continuing fascination with this supposed, what they, I guess, would ask is a contradiction?
Thank you for two really interesting questions, and ones that I could probably stand here and answer at length. So I'm going to try to keep my responses quite brief. So the second question first, as it's the freshest in my mind. I mean, it's hard to, I think, it is. That is a thread, to quote you, of kind of attitudes and disbelief and the incredulity of women's participation that runs through, all the scholarship and all the kind of public understanding of women in fascism. And, there is plenty out there, and it's quite accessible. So I don't know why, as you say, there is, but there's the sexiness, there's a kind of the collision, the crash between, our expectations of an essentialized femininity and political violence. I mean, I think it just comes down to that. And there is it's kind of, as I've said in other contexts, I think that, the excitement is because it kind of evokes kind of the male gaze or excites the male gaze, and the kind of the cat fight of women, either doing violence on themselves, to other women, and the best illustration of that is from the early 30s when the Daily Mail did a campaign, including the headline, "Beauty joins the black shirts." It was able to use women, exploit women, but still try to portray them as patriotic and self-possessed as well. So they were both sex symbols, but they were also, showing that they weren't. So I think it really comes down to, yes, a misogyny, and that if we're talking, it's an objectification of women, obviously, in a very kind of basic sense. And yeah, that really never goes away. And I think it's possibly that, journalists have an assumption that, their mothers are the gentler sex, whether they're women or men. But, I think, certainly at the level of scholarship, that kind of essentialism has been deconstructed, very, very, extensively. So I think that's starting to go away. In terms of gendered experiences of fascist membership, of fascist joiners, I've kind of written a book about it, I suppose is the way to say it. But yes, I mean, the initial expectations on the part of the movement was that there would be, a sharp segregation between the male experience and the female. In fact, that they weren't set up at all to deal with the interest of women members. And Mosley kind of made a virtue of necessity by saying, "Oh yeah, come on in. We're going to have a women's section, and my mother's going to be the head of the women's section. And first my wife, but then she'll die, and then I'll have my mother." It will all be a big family, and it'll be great. And well, oh my God, I realize, of course, women have the vote. I've got to get women in. So I think it was not premeditated. That's very clear. It was very pragmatic and very opportunistic, the way that women are integrated into the movement. But they weren't. These women were flocking to the movement, excited about various aspects of the politics, the ideology, but mainly the action, the activity, getting action, if you like. The fact that many of them wanted to do be in very public roles. They wanted to go to the rallies. They wanted to learn jiu-jitsu. They wanted to wear the uniforms. They wanted to perform. It was a performative gender. And that, again, some interesting examples from the 20s of kind of, performative gender in the case of Rothal Lintor Norman and Mary Allen, and Commandant Mary Allen. So sorry, it was a rather sprawling response to your question, but we can maybe discuss it later.
As usual, Mulhall pipped me the post in being the first question, but I've got many. I'm going to restrict myself to two, and I want to go on this kind of, I think, very fruitful performative gender after your wonderful paper. And the two that I still struggle with to this day, and forgive me, I'm going to come at this as a non-specialist. One, Rothal Linton Orman. I mean, it still feels to me, amidst all of it, still a shocker that Britain's first fascist leader is a woman. And by contrast, the failure, I think, very well established failure of Oswald Mosley. And again, I'm going to gender this slightly, but just looking at that picture there, far more quote unquote manly than Hitler, than Pavlich, than most of the fascist leaders. And I'm broadly content with saying that British society was never going to accept fascists no matter what. But it's hard for me to get away from thinking that is the ideal that fascists wanted in this country, even though it was a miserable failure. Maybe I have that wrong in terms of the gender thing, maybe in the mores of the time, being remarried and so on and so forth. But he struck a much more fascist figure than many of the more successful fascists on the continent.
But not in terms of gender. I think, again, I think, and not in terms of, and, the fact that he began, his career started in the mainstream, that, the first election he won was the first election in which women could vote, that he met his wife when he was campaigning for Nancy Astor as it would happen, become the first woman MP to take her seat. So, it was ingrained. I mean, his wife was, from an illustrious political family, not that she was being encouraged to, Cynthia, to become political, but she's nonetheless did through. So, they were very modern and avant-garde, and I think it's what or of their time, not even avant-garde, just of their time. And there was a real excitement in the immediate post-war period of the potential of the feminization of the political system, of the role of women voters, and of the opportunities now women had to be politicians, to be MPs. So I think it would never. He wasn't a misogynist. He loved women. He loved women, as we know, far too much. And I think that, so did Mussolini. So that's not at all a judge, but it is the content. And it's also, and again, they always emphasize this, and I think there's a lot of truth in that, they would, because they were challenged, there was this immediate equation made between misogyny and fascism, because of reflection on what was going on the continent. And, they could, with some, justification, say that we are following the British tradition, and the gender culture in this country, which is far more liberation, is far, the feminist movement was much stronger and more deeply rooted. Indeed, in many ways it set the trend for suffrage movements in other countries. So I think that it's all about context. It's all about the rootedness. They could say that this is actually our nationalistic inheritance. That we respect women this way, or that we give them these opportunities. So I think that, that's why we can, we feminize or gender British fascism as British fascism.
And that also explains Rosa Liz Norman, I suppose, as well.
Yeah, and I mean, I think she's a really interesting kind of case study, but in terms, she's, I think, she's been underdone in many ways, understudied because of all the things I've mentioned, but at the same time, she doesn't deserve the same kind of attention that we should confer on the 1930s, and that, her impact, or the impact of her movement, was still negligible, much more negligible than what happened in the 1930s. But yeah, her story, I remember when I was asked to write her DNB entry, her ODNB entry, and I had one journalist was writing about the big expansion of the ODNB, and at time, and the only one I forget exactly who it was. The only one he said, why are we having this expansion? Who needs Rothal, Linton, and Orman in the ODNB? So she's always really met that kind of resistance and that kind of dismissal, for better or worse.
I've got some questions from the people watching on Zoom. So I'll give you two first, and there's a third one as well. So one is this is a sort of factual question that probably I should know the answer to. But Joan is asking how many fascists there were in the UK, I suppose in the 30s, might be the most meaningful moment to look at that.
So I can do one at a time, because then I get, yeah.
Sure.
Okay, it's not fine. So that's an easy one. So the estimate's always 40 to 50,000, no membership lists. This is in Mosley's movement. We know, but the numbers we know is that there were peaks and troughs in support, but the high point, the peak was by 1933-34, when they also had the support of the Daily Mail and Lord Rothermere, and the outer estimate is 50,000, and it drops very quickly to the special branch estimates by 35 that there's only 5,000, but then it rises at least slightly again by the late 1930s due to the BUF transforming itself into a notional peace campaign or an anti-war campaign, and there's another fillip of support, and as I say, just over 1,000 are interned.
Yeah, and that's members of the movement, isn't it? Yeah.
The internees are mainly members of the movement. There's some from other movements as well, that are allied ideologically and sometimes, not organizationally with the BUF, like the Anglo-German Fellowship or the Right Club, especially. But yes, they are bedfellows.
Yes. So then a question from Leanne relating to the kind of suffragettes who were fascists. So she's wondering if the appeal of fascism to some suffragettes was linked to mistrust or hatred of a state that had denied them their rights.
That's a really good question, and it's one of the ways in which these women sometimes spun their own life stories and their own personal narratives. But it wasn't very plausible in the end. But yeah, I mean, what they said, what Mary Richardson said, is that she had this very public kind of debate exchange with Sylvia Pankhurst in the newspapers in 34, and she said, why did I join the fascists? So Mary Richardson speaking, I joined the fascists because I saw in them the spirit, the militancy, the revolutionary esprit de corps that I had experienced in the Pankhurst movement and in the suffragette movement. So, she saw that continuity, that parallel as well. But then she very quickly didn't see it because she left in 35 and disillusioned quite specifically with the promises being made and the disingenuousness of the policy towards women in the fascist movement. So yeah, but all the other women made similar points. So Mary Allen, who became a pioneering policewoman or an activist for the establishment of police women in the First World War, and then kind of a independent contractor to that effect throughout the 20s and 30s. She also said, I had already become a poacher turned gamekeeper, and here I was as a policewoman, but again doing supporting a law and order agenda and etc., but still being seen as an outsider and still having to fight for inclusion, to be part of the establishment. So.
Okay, thank you. And then a question from Alan about whether there were differences between urban and rural female fascists, especially as the BUF supported the tithe struggle of the 1930s.
Yeah, I think that doesn't, there is, I'll answer that with reference to the archives we have. I mean, we have an incredible richness about the kind of the rural angle, because we have at Sheffield the Robert Saunders papers, which are the papers of a Devon farmer who was very prominent in the movement, both at local level, and he was well connected with with headquarters. Now, it's a completely distorted picture because we could have many other personal archives. We just happen to have those. So we do have insight into rural life. And there are a number of women who figure in that. But what I'll say, which actually I think ties in nicely with the last panel, and again, the longer durée history of ecofascism, many women, again, had used that expression, kind of had a salad bar of causes. And what it was seen as very compatible, or a good dressing on a nice bit of lettuce, was anti-vivisectionism, and their objection to kosher methods of meat slaughter. So it was their way of, it's not always clear which chicken and the egg here, I suppose that's a good way of putting it, whether their objection to kosher methods were thanks to their anti-Semitism, or they started as anti-vivisectionists and became, but they certainly very quickly married the two impulses, and one fed the other very ravenously.
That was absolutely fascinating. Most of your stories, your anecdotes, though, could come from the last 20 years, maximum the last 30 years. And as you pointed out, especially at the beginning, the memory reacts to what's happening in our society today, which is possibly one reason why I find it really interesting that there's more women as a percentage in Irish fascism than there was in British fascism. We never talk about them. And the blue shirts, yeah. And yet there's a cottage industry around British female fascists. Did no one talk about British female fascists before the 1990s? Is there a history of interest and rise and fall that predates your research?
I mean, thank you. Thanks for it's an interesting question. I mean, historiographically, in the small cottage industry of British fascist studies, it is in the 1990s when the first longer studies. I mean, women are mentioned here and there, and of course, I had to do my literature surveys like everyone else and trace the historiography. So there's little mention, but they're a real kind of side issue, in treatments by the pioneering historians in the field. Just because that women's history wasn't in no way mainstreamed in the academy anyway, so it was easy to ignore or to kind of tokenize women in that way. But what I also wanted to say was I've lost the thought, but so I think it has a lot to do with what is happening in the academy as much as what is happening in society. But in terms of I think the way that fascist families were dealing with their past wouldn't have been in a gendered way. They either had a fascist father or a fascist mother, or and they dealt with that as family memories. They weren't at all kind of fixated on the telling this in a feminist or a non-feminist or a gendered way. It was it was not the way that those who had the personal stories and the baggage, they didn't tend to be especially surprised by, oh, it was my mother who did this, or for instance, in the Trevor Grundy story, it's his mother both parents were devoted members, but it was his mother who was much more militant, much more, and because as we discover her own real the fact her own family history, she normally wouldn't have been a fascist under any other circumstances. So there's that kind of that big reveal, that shock value in that story. But he's not interested. He's interested in her as his mother, not as a woman fascist.
Couple of things to say just to wrap up the conference. So yeah, don't get too excited.
Do you mind if I mean, that was just fucking awesome. So that was just,
Not recorded.
So don't get too excited. We've still got a couple more minutes. It falls to me to put an end to today's proceedings. But before I do, I need to thank a few people. First and foremost, Leia, was up until early hours of this morning getting the sound sorted out, and has done a really pioneering and amazing job this morning. I also want to thank Barbara from the Wiener Holocaust Library, who's been the driving force behind this conference from the beginning, and who's done the lion's share of the work putting it together. And thanks also to the rest of the staff for making today possible. Second, thank you to Matthew Feldman from the Center for Analysis of the Radical Right, also known as CAR, who has been instrumental in helping us plan and organize the conference. For those of you who aren't already familiar with the great work that CAR do, it's worth checking out their website at radicalrightanalysis.com, where you can find a lot of excellent resources, including op-ed pieces, book reviews, reports on the radical right today, the world's largest bibliography of anything and everything you could possibly want on the far right. Huge thanks to Joe Mulhall from Hope Not Hate, who's also been very helpful behind the scenes organizing today. You heard a bit about Joe's work this morning, but keep in mind, you can also become part of it with volunteering, fundraising, and they've even got an online shop so you can buy like merchandise. Thank you to both of our keynotes and to our other speakers who shared so much of their knowledge and expertise. Hopefully this isn't the last we see of each other, and we'll be able to stay in touch. Finally, he's not here, but thank you to Tim Grady from the University of Chester, who couldn't be here today, but he's my partner in the European Fascist Movements project, one of the curators of the This Fascist Life exhibit, and he's done a lot as well in the planning of the conference. I also have a couple of announcements. So the first is that the research project that this exhibition is based on is not over yet. We have an app coming out, hopefully within the next week or so, which illustrates some of the research that's emerged from the project. And we're currently sorting our way through editing the chapters of a book of translated primary sources on fascist movements from 18 different countries, which we hope will really transform the way that scholars and students think and talk about what fascist activism looked like on the ground in practice. The manuscript's due to Routledge in the next few months, so keep an eye open for that, either later in the year or early next year. And most of us missed it because we were here at this conference, but this morning was also the launch of the European Network of Anti-Fascist Monitoring, or ENAM, and its website, antifascist-europe.org. For those of you who don't know, because I didn't, ENAM is an anti-fascist research project focused on the inter and transnational networks, cooperation and interaction of far-right players all over Europe. And the scope of its monitoring ranges from right-wing terrorist groups to fascist neo-Nazi comradeships, new right fellowships, conservative think tanks and parties, both inside and outside Parliament, on the national and the European level. And what they're doing, what they've done, is they've created a website and database of constantly updated data, seeking to build on and contribute to existing monitoring done by anti-fascist groups on the local or regional level, and to strengthen the capacities of anti-fascists. So it's both a scholarly enterprise and an activist enterprise. And I think it's well worth having on your radar and checking it out. So thank you again all for your contributions today, and hang around for some food. Thank you.
Thanks, Roland.